Well, good morning, Deputy Mayor Colbone, and let me give my greetings also to Dean Oriel Amat, to Mario Rubet from Barcelona Activa, and to all of our friends in Barcelona and around the world. It's a great opportunity and a great honor for me to be here today, speaking to you and providing the keynote introductory speech to this conference. I'm speaking to you from a sunny central London, where life in central London is getting back to some kind of new normal in a slow and very cautious way, as you would understand. I want to say that COVID-19 really has three important dimensions that we'll talk about today. Clearly, it's a human health crisis, which is still playing out around the world in various ways, and anybody like me who watches the news from Latin America, from India, from North America, knows that the peak of the crisis is still to come in many countries, and the human death toll is growing all of the time. We're also very aware of the emergence of second peaks and second spikes, and of course, our wonderful friends in Barcelona have experienced a version of this, but they are not the only ones. And we're also aware, of course, that the length of time it's going to take to produce a comprehensive vaccine means that it's quite likely that we will have winter spikes and other things as we move forward. So this crisis is not over. It's going to be for quite some time, and the longer it lasts, the bigger the change effect that it has. The second thing, of course, is that COVID-19 is an economic shock. And this economic shock is leading to a recession which is deep in character, will have variable lengths around the world, but will be a recession that tackles and hits particular kinds of activities much harder than others. And I will talk a little bit about those later on. This is not a general recession. It's a recession with a particular edge. And some of that edge goes against industries that are traditionally well urbanized. We'll talk about that. But the third thing I want to say about COVID-19 is that I believe it's an agent of change. It's an opportunity, if you like. The word crisis, as we know, includes the idea of opportunity, especially in Chinese, but also in a number of Indian languages. And I would suggest to you that this opportunity, this agency of change that COVID-19 produces is one that requires communication. And the communication that's required needs to address not just immediate challenges and problems, but communication needs to address longer-term aspirations. It needs to address multiple audiences. It needs to address, as it were, the essence of what we seek to be in the long term, not just the things we need to do in the short term. So in a very particular and interesting way, COVID-19 raises important and interesting questions about branding. Branding as the deep well of the ideas that underpin all communication becomes more important because of COVID-19, because of this role it plays as an agent of change, not just as a shock or a crisis. Now, much of what I'm going to say today is about COVID-19 as an accelerator of trends. And some of those trends are accelerated in such a way that we see rather peculiar things happening at the same time. For example, I think that COVID-19 is disrupting what we would call face-to-place activities. The activities where people gather in certain locations and where they enjoy those locations, face-to-place has been disrupted. At the same time, we might say that face-to-space has been accelerated. We spend more time staring into the space of our computer screens, engaging in many different kinds of online activities, which I will describe a little bit later on. So as face-to-place is disrupted, face-to-space is accelerated, and at the same time, something else, face-to-face, people getting together, being with each other, this has been not just disrupted, but also in a funny way relocated. so that we start to meet with people in places we didn't used to meet, and we no longer meet them in places where we used to meet. So we've disrupted face-to-place, we have accelerated face-to-space, and we are relocating face-to-face. COVID-19 is proving to be a major source of changes in cities that we have to understand if we want to communicate well, and we have to use, of course, our understanding of our city brand to do that. So let's talk about how this works. Just before COVID-19, we were in an interesting phase, what I would call entering into the 5th decade of the century of the city. That 5th decade of the century of the city was seeing us in 2020 move from where we had been in 1980, when 40% of the world's 6 billion people lived in cities, to 2080, when 80% of the world's 9.5 billion people will be living in cities, a trebling of the number of people and a doubling of the percentage at the same time. And by the beginning of 2020, this was producing what I would call a highly distributed system of cities around the world. It was no longer the case that a small group of cities, in this chart described as the Big Seven, were the only cities that mattered. We were rapidly entering an era where more than 100 cities had become very important cities in one way or another to our global systems of trade, of talent production, of capital accumulation, and of cultural enterprise. More than 100 cities playing very different kinds of roles in a global economic system which was increasingly integrated in one way or another. And you can see, as you look at this chart, that these cities were beginning to leverage different kinds of advantage. The cities in the middle perhaps leveraging their scale and their corporate clustering. The cities on the right-hand side leveraging the fast growth of their young populations in large numbers to become gateways with global systems. The cities on the left-hand side leveraging high quality of life and advantages in new technologies to become world-class cities in new economic and industrial sectors. So we saw a change to the way the urban system was working, a more distributed urban system with many more cities ready to succeed. But we could also see, as the century of cities was unfolding, that there was, as it were, not just the innate advantages of cities seen here on the left-hand side. We saw on aggregate that cities are good at reducing poverty and increasing social mobility, that cities are able to increase the productivity of firms, of labor, and of systems, that cities are, on average, per capita, efficient ways to utilize resources and other things, and to produce systems that are environmentally efficient overall. We see that cities increase trade and connectivity, and that cities produce revenues, assets, and systems, as well as amenities for population. So many reasons for us to understand how cities work.
Excuse me, Greg. But people is asking if you can put the PowerPoint in full screen. The people attendees are demanding.
How's that?
Sorry for interrupting. Thank you very much. Sorry for doing.
Thank you, Mario. So on the one hand side of the promise of urbanization, the promise of the city that people were able to see, but of course, people very aware that there's a risk of bad urbanization. And that bad urbanization would come from the population growth and the growth in visitors that would outstrip the carrying capacity of the cities. Too many cars on the road, too many tourists visiting, too many people seeking to own property, creating congestion, pollution, inefficiency, segregation, unsafe and uncrowded. And what has been revealed, of course, is that in some cities, the very density of urban life, the large numbers of people living in close confinement with one another or working together in places where there is insufficient ventilation and other things. This has produced the new phenomena of bad urbanization, contagion. Now, those of us who are urban historians understand very well that every time in the past that there has been a contagion in cities, it has led to the most extraordinary innovations. Innovations in relation to public health, to hospitals, to sewer systems, to municipal waste systems. Many improvements have been made in our cities when there has been contagion in the past. And there's no reason to assume that that won't happen again. Our cities will learn to innovate here, but the risk of bad urbanization is now strongly associated with the idea of contagion. And so we must move to what we would call the promise of good urbanization, cities that are well organized, more agile, utilizing new technologies, more intelligent, high levels of capital investment, enabling cities to shift to a new kind of paradigm. And we'll come back to that shortly. Now, the relationship between cities and climate change was also very well understood prior to the pandemic. On the one hand, we know that cities produce high levels of carbon emissions because of the concentration of vehicle-based transport in systems and because of the energy inefficiency of buildings, as well as the construction process itself. We understand that 80% of all of the carbon emissions produced in cities come from the built environment and from the mobility systems. And at the same time, as you can see, cities are vulnerable to climate change. Here you see the 600 cities that are vulnerable to a 0.5 meter rise in sea levels up to 2050. The rise in sea levels that we would see if we failed to stay within the 2 degrees of global warming agreed at the Paris conference several years ago. So this is why cities have begun to address the zero carbon agenda and to be very clear about that. Now, COVID-19 has entered this situation, bringing with it a fresh set of imperatives and a fresh set of challenges for cities. I'm going to try to talk about these very quickly before then coming to the communication challenge that cities need to address. To put it very simply, I would say COVID-19 has revealed 6 new imperatives that between them produce a jobs alert for cities and a city alarm that means that we must change and reconfigure our cities to make them much more agile and tell our story of cities differently. The first of these is the revealed inadequacies of trade and supply chains that are based only on efficiency and not on resilience. If you like, the failure of our global supply chains to be able to operate during the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns that occurred has revealed that we placed too much emphasis on global efficiency and not enough on resilience and intelligence in our supply chains. And this is leading, of course, to an agenda of sovereign capability and capacity, needing to meet our own needs within our own borders, at least in some specific areas: food, medical supplies, energy, critical components for national security, critical components for strategically important industries. All of these sectors are moving towards what we might call a just-in-case rather than a just-in-time approach. The second big theme has been technology, digitization, and as-a-service business models. As we have increased our use of digital platforms, not just in video conferencing as we do today and in flexi working, but in telemedicine and distance learning, in online retail, online consumption of cultural entertainment, online participation in esports and other things. So this increase has led to a huge challenge to the business models of many different urban economy activities, particularly ones that require face-to-face and face-to-face activities. As a consequence, businesses are transforming very rapidly to as-a-service business models, particularly engaged in delivery, but also in partial utilization, and the sharing economy is growing very, very rapidly. This is producing a major challenge for how we use space and how we travel within cities, and we'll come back to that. The third key trigger that COVID-19 has brought is a revelation in public health issues. On the one hand, COVID-19 has revealed the inadequacy of public health services in many locations, and at the same time, it's revealed very sharp and deep inequalities, so that people from particular demographic groups, people of certain ages, people with particular health backgrounds, especially respiratory health, have found themselves being much more ill than people in other demographic groups. And this has played out particularly on racial and ethnic divides, as we've seen recently in many parts of North America, in Latin America, and elsewhere. This is producing a public sentiment that we need to have much stronger investment in healthcare, and we need to resolve these inadequacies. But the link between human health and planetary health has also been a feature of what COVID-19 has produced. And whether it's because of the link between air quality and respiratory health, poor air quality resulting from high levels of emissions, producing high levels of respiratory ill health that makes people vulnerable to COVID-19, or whether it's, for example, the explanation that it's an interaction between the animal kingdom and our food systems that have created COVID-19, or whether it's the experience of lockdown where reduction in activities of one kind or another have led to us having a low touch, low mobility, low consumption, low carbon lifestyle. This has proved to be a kind of proof of concept, or an accidental experiment in low carbon living, which has demonstrated that it's possible for us to run a productive economy to some degree without emitting so much carbon. And it leads to, I think, some forceful imperatives for us to decarbonize much more quickly as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. The fifth theme that has been revealed by COVID-19 is a changed politics, particularly changed politics on the one hand between citizens and national governments, where national governments have been much more proactive in the lives of citizens, creating new mechanisms of control, creating new large data sets to track and trace how citizens are behaving and what they're doing, the introduction of many more bylaws, a different approach to policing. Citizens are learning to accept a deeper role for national governments in their lives, or to, of course, to rebel against these. But the tendency is there towards a new, strong nation-state approach. At the same time, partly because of the trade and supply route changes, we're seeing some retreat from multilateral global governance arrangements and a move back into what we might call a more competitive nationalism kind of approach. This has major implications for how cities operate and function, and how cities are seen to be, as it were, in tandem with these nation-state agendas, where cities may be able to contribute much more to national competitiveness and productivity, reshoring certain jobs into urban economies, or whether they wish to become beacons of civil liberties and to operate against nation states in terms of their approach on civil liberties, privacy, cybersecurity, and everything else. Now, the sixth big theme that has emerged is the theme that I would call the new social contract. This is the theme where people have been realizing as a result of the COVID-19 crisis that there is, on the one hand, a new neighborliness around. People are enjoying spending time with their neighbors. New kinds of social capital are emerging. Mutual aid efforts, community organizations, more kinds of local philanthropy have emerged. And there's a strong desire amongst citizens to come out of this crisis more unified, more focused on the ties that bind us together, utilizing our social capital and our neighborliness in new ways to solve problems. For example, through tactical urbanism, through citizens' action groups, through other kinds of urbanization that are led and organized by citizens. So taken together, these 6 big imperatives and impulses that COVID-19 has revealed produce for us, I think, 2 very specific things. On the one hand, we need to be concerned about the future of jobs in our cities. It's very clear that digitization at the speed at which it's now being deployed is going to reduce large numbers of jobs, and we need to be focused very strongly on creating new forms of jobs. But it's also very clear that we need to be concerned about the layout, the format, and the systems of our city. You see, the cumulated effect of the digitization is to change the way we're able to use office space and buildings. It's to give people more choices about where they work, how they travel, when they go into the city center, and when they decide to work in other ways from other locations. This has big consequences for our public transport systems in our cities, but it also has major consequences for all buildings that have a singular use, whether it's office buildings, retail parks, convention centers, or sports stadia. All of these buildings will need to demonstrate a new kind of agility in helping the city to recover, and not just to recover, but as it were, to reconfigure itself for the new post-pandemic reality. Let's talk a little bit about what this post-pandemic reality might be. Many people have spoken about how through COVID-19, we seem to be embracing the virtual city and leaving the physical city. It's as if during the lockdown, we lived in the physical city, but we didn't use it. And instead, we began to adopt the features of the virtual city using our internet networks and our digitized platforms and new business models to try to achieve all of the services that we required. Now, some people are predicting that we will leave the physical city forever, and that COVID-19 marks an end in the century of the city and a shift towards a completely new reality in which geography, physical space, physical amenities don't matter at all. I completely disagree with that point of view. I think where we are headed instead is towards a kind of blended city, where we take advantage of all of the new opportunities that arise from virtualization, but we still enjoy the physical assets and attributes of the city with all the opportunities it provides for face-to-face and face-to-space activity. But I think the difference is now that this blended city is capable of having a much larger geography than the physical city that we enjoyed before. And indeed, I think it creates many, many new choices as to where citizens live, where their job is located, which assets and amenities they use, and how frequently they use the city. So one of my overall predictions would be that we move towards a more blended kind of urbanization, where this blended city produces a more distributed map. So we shift from the kinds of forms of urbanization we used in the first decades of the century of the city that you can see in the top line here, and we move much more towards the forms of urbanization you see in the second line and the third line, where in a city like Barcelona becomes much more important to embrace not just the metropolitan area, but the whole really of the Catalonia region, and certainly the numbers of cities and towns within the Diputación. It makes it much easier for people to live in one place and work in another. And this blended city has the idea of full-time as well as part-time citizens. It has the idea of a weekly commute rather than a daily commute, and it provides all sorts of new flexibilities. Now, into this context, we need to learn a new way of talking about cities. We need to be able, in this context, to communicate not just with the residents of the city, but with everyone who operates with and in the city and enjoys using its amenities. And as Deputy Mayor Colbone said very clearly at the beginning of this seminar, this means that we have to understand the DNA code of our city. We need to understand those aspects of the DNA which are endowed. They come from the natural territorial assets. And those ones which are inherited, they come from previous cycles in which the city has evolved, and they create a kind of superstructure in which the city works. And we also have to understand the coding of the city which is acquired, ones which are, as it were, the production of human activity, both in this cycle and in others. And in this way, we can see that cities accumulate their DNA over multiple cycles. They can more or less leverage and align with their DNA. And the epigenetics of the city, the scarring of the genetic code, can be something that produces wounds and scars, but it can also produce recovery and regeneration if we use it wisely. So I want to come on to make 3 propositions to conclude my contribution to this seminar. In the context of COVID-19 and thinking about the recovery of our cities, we need to recognize that city branding can do 5 things very well. City branding can use the DNA of a city to distill the uniqueness of the city in order to, 1, promote and sell the city, 2, create and inspire a sense of identity, of place, a sense of belonging. 3, it can unite a city with a common purpose and a new social capital, producing new ideas and visions for the future. 4, it can help to plan the future city, to design the new infrastructures, the new buildings, the new projects, and to develop them around the discovered DNA. And 5, it can help to position the city in relation to other domains, like national governments, national spaces, transnational spaces, and others. And all of these roles in one way overlap. But I think much more attention is paid to how we use city branding to sell and promote the city, and not enough attention is paid to how we use city branding to create the sense of identity, to unite the city, to plan for the future, and to position the city in relation to other kinds of domains. I propose to you that what COVID-19 does is to invite us to fully utilize the power of the brand of the city by engaging not just in number 1, but in number 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if we do that, we have another task as well. COVID-19 is producing a kind of attack against cities. And for many people, there's the idea that COVID-19 presents the opportunity to say why cities are bad and why everywhere else is good. It should be more important for all of us involved in city branding, not to help one city to beat another city in a competition, but to use city branding to help 6,000 cities succeed, to demonstrate not just that city X is good, but that all cities are capable of good urbanization, as I was saying in the beginning. COVID-19 is much more of a threat to the idea of cities than it is a threat to individual cities. And so all city branders should see themselves now as a kind of global alliance for the city. When you think about COVID-19, you might think of it as a white swan, something that is beautiful that you wanted to see. I doubt anybody in this seminar thinks that way. Many people will see it as a black swan, a swan that is bringing unwelcome and unexpected shocks and crises and changes. And there is an element of COVID-19 that is a black swan. But some of us might also choose to see COVID-19 as a green swan, bringing the opportunity of change, especially change that is towards reconciling humanity with planet through cities. And finally, some people will see it as a blue swan, a swan that enables us to leapfrog a whole cycle of technology in order not just to improve our digital communications, but also to use these technologies to include and to promote the health of our planet as well as the health of our people. So for people who work in the area of city branding, especially in progressive cities, I think we must use city branding during our post-pandemic years, firstly to explain how cities work, to remind everyone that cities are themselves public goods. They are sharing platforms, they're common systems, they're gateways, and they're accelerators of social progression and innovation. We should use city branding to demonstrate that we can have high amenity, medium density living, that density is not an enemy. We should use city branding to reveal that cities are innovators, especially in the zero carbon agenda that we need to embrace post the pandemic. We should also demonstrate that cities are mediators. They set global agendas, they have great convening power, and they bring people together. We should also use city branding to highlight how leaders and citizens learn to trust one another, especially in times of crisis. And we can use city branding to demonstrate that cities are prepared for the future black swans, green swans, and blue swans. In other words, that cities are able to use the pandemic to become more agile and to prepare for future shocks. So my proposition to you today is that city branding is more necessary than ever, but we must adjust the focus of our city branding not to promote simply individual cities, but to promote all cities, and to use city branding to reveal how cities can align with their DNA in order to address the 7 or 8 imperatives that COVID-19 has revealed. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you very much to all of you, to Dean Oriol Amat, to First Deputy Mayor Jaume Comui-Boni, and to Professor Greg Clark, who is always enlightening to hear from you. We still have 5-10 minutes, and I have been able to pick 4 questions from the audience. Probably some of them have been made before the end of the speech, and with all the speech, it has been already answered a little bit, but I would like to also to tell them to you. So I have 4 questions, Greg. First of one is, how can we work on city reputation when all cities are tackling the same global crisis of reputation caused by the pandemic? So it's a general reputational crisis. Second question is, it seems that the traditional assets of cities as density, proximity, interaction are questions. As you said, the city is the devil for somebody. Which are the new assets cities need to work on to win reputation and win differentiation one from the others? Third question is, what do you think Barcelona needs to do to move from the list of influence cities to the list of established world cities? Okay, and last question is, do you foresee mergers or special alliances between cities in this new scenario? If you need me to repeat one for you because you forget, just tell me. Okay, Greg?
Yeah, Mario, these questions are fine. I wrote them down as you said.
Okay.
Okay, well, very quickly, let's just do mergers and alliances and acquisitions. What I am saying is that I think the effective scale of every city now changes. And those changes mean that the city itself is in a new network or a new alliance with many other locations around it. In China, this is very visible because if we take, for example, Shanghai, 128 cities are in the Yangtze River Delta. With the combination of digitization and high-speed rail, any one of those cities is connected to any other of those cities in about a 3-hour train ride it means it's completely possible to live in any one of those cities and work in any other. Therefore, these big regional groupings of cities become very, very important. In the European scale, where we might be thinking about high-speed rail, or we may even be thinking about a return to commuting by aviation, it means that the effective scale of any city is the scale at which people are willing to live in one place and work in another. So for Barcelona, this means, as I said, the whole of Catalonia, for sure, but probably the labor market of Barcelona and the labor market of Madrid and Valencia will begin to have such large overlaps that everybody will want to live in Zaragoza, in the sense that they will be able to work in Barcelona or Madrid or Valencia. For Zaragoza, this is great. But what I really mean here is that the effective geographic scale of all cities has become enlarged by digitization, and it will help cities to have good working relationships with all of the other places around with whom they will increasingly share a population base. Now, what does Barcelona need to do to become an established world city? Barcelona is already on the road to become this. Barcelona needs to leverage, of course, all of its knowledge economy assets, its supercomputer, its fantastic medical system, its world-class digital research. It needs to focus a great degree on its innovation agenda, its global challenge agenda, and it needs to achieve the advantages of scale. And that scale will come from embracing this larger area, so certainly the metropolitan area of Barcelona, but I think also larger areas around in Catalonia and other neighboring cities. So in order to do that, it needs to have world-class specialization in high knowledge and high technology companies. It needs to have that effective scale. It needs to have a business brand as well as a visitor brand, what is sometimes called as a business card and not just a postcard. And it needs to be very serious about this project over the next period of time, emphasizing its business expertise. On the reputational issues of cities, I think it's very important that as cities are managing the COVID-19 crisis, as so many are, they do it in a way that they demonstrate that they are also thinking about the future. It's very, very clear, is it not, that it's one thing to attend to a crisis as an absolute urgency. It's another thing to say the way we solve our short-term problems is with our eye on the future and the kind of city, the kind of metropolis that we're trying to create for then. And so it's very important, I think, for cities to be talking about their economic recovery plan, their environmental recovery plan, to talk about the future of their public spaces, to talk about how they're going to reignite their visitor economy, especially in international students and conventions and other parts of the visitor economy that are highly productive. We need to be very clear about what the economic and social recovery is of the city, as well as its cultural recovery, not just the management of the pandemic. And I think this is the skill of very skilled leaders. And I know this is true in Barcelona. The other thing that, of course, is very clear, and I think this was the second question, is that the cities do need to be able to reconfigure themselves. I think there will be changes. For example, cities that have traditionally had one large central business area with almost all other areas being residential areas, this will change. I think that there will be new distribution of activities and opportunities in neighborhoods. So much more, for example, co-working spaces in residential neighborhoods, much more distribution of retail and cafes into neighborhoods and other things. Some of these are already the features of some cities that are participating today. But we will also see some of our central business areas reconfiguring themselves, perhaps so that more people will be living in buildings that used to be used only for working. So we may even see an increase in population density in city centers as we go through this agile reconfiguration of the cities. This will take some years to play out, and it will depend a lot upon the appetite of the asset owners. And we will also see, of course, changes in our mobility systems within the cities. Those cities that have a strong core public transport system will see it augmented by lots of other kinds of active transport, cycling, scooters, walking, running, and many other things. Those that don't have a strong core public transport system will, I think, see the emergence of many new sharing platforms for transportation that will be risk assured in various ways. Of course, how long it takes to get a vaccine will determine how quickly the core dense public transport systems recover. But until then, there will be many innovations in how we use public transport systems, reserving seats on buses and trains, using much more protective equipment of one kind or another. It's going to be a time of great innovation.